So the topic today is actually, how does your type fight? So we, in essence, talking about conflict. Now, I was thinking that if somebody held a gun to my head and they forced me to choose amongst so many brilliant assessments and tools and methods, I would probably choose the MBTI as a particularly valuable tool, not the only one, but a particularly valuable one. So in my 50 years of being, about 50 years being a psychologist, and in my 32 years of being a business owner, the MBTI has consistently provided me with invaluable insights, and I sometimes in my head call it wisdom. So understanding with regards to people and their style, understanding teams and team dynamics, understanding how a person fits into a specific department, understanding the dynamics around leadership, the strengths and the blind spots, understanding problem solving, understanding stress responses, understanding task preferences, and specifically also conflict, because it is the name of the game in most organizations, all organizations. Conflict is something that happens regularly. So instead of being tearful or fearful or angry or frustrated with conflict, you can, with the MBTI, get to an understanding of it. And with understanding what you know, you can better manage. And even to the point, if you understand conflict, sometimes you can look at conflict and manage it, but with a twinkle in the eye. So I'm looking forward to Jani talking about conflict today. How does your type fight? And specifically about Jani, you saw it in the advert for the event as well. She's got more than 15 years experience as an industrial psychologist. And what makes Jani unique is the way in which she pragmatically works with many things, with the MBTI and with type. So Jan, we're really looking forward to what you can share about type and conflict in an hour. We know this cannot replace a full certification, but let us fly over the topic and understand as much of it as is possible. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Yopi, and thank you for everybody attending today as well. Today is a little bit of a difficult audience. So we are a big audience, and we do have a good mix between people who's already certified on the MBTI and people who are not certified. And the idea behind today is for us to look at conflict from a type perspective, but to add value to those who may not be certified or not necessarily know a lot about type in essence, but also to those who might just have not necessarily delve into type recently and they need a little bit of a refresher, and those who may work with type on a daily basis, like Yopi mentioned as well. Now, I do urge you that there where you want to comment on anything that I'm saying, please add your comments and your questions to the text box. We would love to, we will be responding to those. And if there's any questions that we can't immediately respond to, we will be sending you a reply afterwards. We will also be sharing some of the information that it will be shared with you today. And please remember that there is one CPD point, or 1 point assigned to this specific webinar. So there will be a quiz that you will see a link to afterwards. And then something that we'll share afterwards as well, and I think you saw that in the advertisement, is that those who that are not certified on the MBTI, for only the next certification, the upcoming certification, because you attended this specific webinar, we will allow a 20% discount on that specific certification, which is for those of you who know, is quite a big thing. So that we will share afterwards, as well as how you can potentially, if you're interested, register for certification. but we do have, as you've mentioned, quite a lot to cover. So let's get started. First of all, as mentioned in the advert as well, we will be looking at a recent white paper that was published by NBC with a lot of insights that they share around conflict, and I'll be unpacking some of those insights, but we will also share the link to this white paper for you to delve into afterwards. We will be looking at conflict from a type perspective, but looking at it through 3 different lenses. Now, there's multiple lenses. We only have time for 3 of those, and I'll be using a case study with each of those lenses so that you can just get a little bit of a sense of how we work with that. And then last but not least, there's a very basic conflict management model that even though in its absolute simplicity, it's really something that I find a lot of value in. So let's get digging. First of all, this specific white paper that I've got on the left-hand side of the screen here has been published in 2022, which is already about, well, 3 years ago. But they've since then done a lot of work around the concept of conflict. Now, this specific white paper, even though it's not a massive number of respondents that took part in this specific study, it is still quite valuable due to the amount of information that they gathered from the respondents that took part. So each of the respondents had to complete the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, the TKI, which is the Thomas Kilmann inventory, which is a conflict style inventory, together with a very thorough qualitative biographical information form or questionnaire that asked them a lot of things about their engagement, their line manager, and various other things that we'll look at. Just to give you a sense of the respondents that took part, 93% of them were full-time employed. The majority of them came from the US. However, South Africa was also represented in the sample, as were a number of other countries as well. This was across job levels, so it wasn't only focused on a specific job level or entry job level, making it particularly relevant. Apologies, I see that I'm purple. Then we've got 39% of the sample actually had the current working was going between both in-person and virtual. So, going about the hybrid working model, with 27% of them needing to be in the office and the rest virtual. And then most of these respondents were situated or permanently employed in large corporates, with a small percentage self-employed, but the rest of them were typically within corporates that had more than 500, more than 1,000 employees. But let's look at some of the findings. Now, first of all, conflict. Now, this is a very basic definition, description that was used in this report specifically, and it just shows or it just describes what they view conflict to be. So it's any instance where people think that what they care about, or where there appears to be incompatibility between people. Now, what is important to note here is that conflict, and this is something we all know, conflict can be very constructive. There can be amazingly positive results stemming from conflict, especially if we think of growth and diversity. So conflict isn't necessarily a destructive force. It really depends on how it's being managed. What also makes, I think, makes sense in terms of why the topic of conflict is so popular these days is the respondents indicated that on average they spend 4.5 hours per week dealing with conflict. Now, this is quite a large chunk of your productive time that needs to be spent on something other than work, which is, again, just showcasing why we deem understanding conflict, managing conflict effectively as a very important skill to address. And then they were also asked, and there were a number of options that they had, that they could choose from. I think there was about 20 odd options that they could choose from in terms of causes of workplace conflict. And the top 4 causes that was identified for these respondents as the top causes of workplace conflict in particular was communication problems, heavy workloads, being under pressure, different goals and objectives, being unclear of what it is that they need to do, and then personality differences as being the top 4 causes, leading causes of conflict. Now, furthering some of the research findings, they were also asked who is the person or who is responsible for managing conflict in the workplace, with most of the respondents identifying their direct manager or line manager being the person that would take most of the responsibility for conflict, but very soon to follow is everybody should take responsibility for conflict. They also said that 98% of conflict, 98% of people identified that conflict handling is an essential skills for managers to have. I mean, which makes sense after they've just identified that their manager often takes responsibility for conflict. It clearly makes sense that they all said, yes, see, this is essential and all managers and leaders should know how to deal with conflict. I think what is also quite insightful is the fact that they reported on saying that more than half of them said that their managers could definitely improve on how they deal with conflict. Which is again also insightful, especially if we think of the amount of time that is being spent on conflict. And then when they were asked, so what, again, out of a list of things, different things that they could identify as what they could do better, the top 3 things that was addressed, what they thought that their managers could do better was to listen more. So to actually get more opinions, views, to ensure that they don't only immediately respond, but that they actually just first of all gather the information and all information required, that they communicate more regularly and more clearly, and that they address conflict quickly, directly, but also very effectively. So early in the process, and not let it actually grow into something much larger than what it initially could have been if it was dealt with effectively from the start. Now, listening to some of these findings that's reported in this, it is quite clear that a lot of what we see in this report, stems around or built around the interpersonal, the power skills, the soft skills. Hence also why it makes so much sense to actually then to understand what the value is that the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator could actually provide you in dealing with conflict, because it's such a core tool which is often used in conflict resolution as well. Now, I know most of you know this, but it just helps, again, for me sometimes to reflect a little bit about on where the Myers-Briggs came from and why it is actually important to note. Now, knowing that it stemmed from, Carl Jung and the absolute invaluable work that was done by him in the early 1900s, where he published a book on psychological types, really doing a incredible work to try and understand human behavior at that point in time. From there, a mother and daughter team identified, actually the mother, it's actually a nice story, but the mother was quite curious about trying to understand her new son-in-law's personality, and she was really intrigued to try and understand it and started with her own research in figuring out how people can be so different. And in her trying to figuring it out, she came across the work that Jung did. And she and her daughter, Isabel, then started developing what is now known as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So I think what makes this so valuable for me to understand is that this is, first of all, I mean, it stood the test of time, but second of all, it actually came from a place where people wanted to take what has been done on a theoretical basis and ensure that it actually makes practical sense. They started off employing or using the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator during World War II, especially to understand and support nurses, to improve communication. So to practically make sure that it's not, that the work that Jung did didn't only remain in PhDs and scriptures, but it actually is pulled through to make a difference in normal people's lives. And this is why the Myers-Briggs is so popular typically in situations or situations like, for example, conflict or conflict resolution, because the way in which personality is described using the Myers-Briggs is positive. And there's not a lot of theories that actually facilitates that. You know, our typical trait-based personality assessments tend to compare people more, hence why we use it for selection as well. But the Myers-Briggs are really non-threatening, and there's no worse or better types. And specifically in sensitive situations where there's a lot of conflict, it is essential not to make it even more sensitive, and hence why I don't have anything better to use when conflict situations. Well, personally, I don't make use of anything else, especially where I believe that there's trust issues or conflict issues. I wish I could change my face to not being purple. I don't know, Andrea, if you could maybe do anything, but hope that it doesn't bother anybody else. So what type is not about? The idea is definitely not to put anybody in a box. The idea is not to be prescriptive. The idea is not for somebody to feel constrained within that you are only your type and nothing but your type. That is very far from the truth. And for anybody who's been trained on the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator would know that this is not the intention of type. We often see criticism around type from people not understanding what the intention is, you know, why and how type is intended to be used. So again, it is not for labeling people. It is, however, a tool that is used to ensure that we understand differences and that we don't see it as flaws. Now, this is a quote from David Kersey, who is a very influential, very well-known individual in the world of type and did a lot of his own work around temperaments. But I do think what is important for me in the saying is that this is not something, understanding each other's personality preferences isn't something that you just wake up being able to do. It requires quite a lot of work. Now, to his saying, he says, to each his own, is the old saying, now modernized as different strokes for different folks, really accepting each other that way. Now, to achieve the intent of these sayings will take a lot of work in coming to see our differences as something other than flaws. And I would challenge all of you to think of where you've come across somebody recently who are different than what you are, and whether your first reaction may have been slightly more from a critical angle instead of an accepting angle, because that is what we naturally tend to do. Now, that gives us a little bit of history and also positioning around how important conflict is. But I do think, and again, I've not built this in, I'm going to very briefly go through the different dichotomies, especially for those who are not trained yet or not necessarily 100% familiar with it. But it is necessary for me to briefly go through this in order for you to understand some of the conflict lenses and case studies that I'll be dealing with. Before I start with extroversion, introversion, I do want you to think of type using the same very well-known analogy of handwriting preferences. All of us have got a preferred hand with which we write with. And then we have a less preferred hand. What is known is that we use both of these hands. It's not that we make use of only one hand, and we can also, I'm for example right-handed, the more I practice my left hand, the better I'll become in my left hand, and in certain instances my left hand is very important. So in the same applies to type and personality preferences. We've got an inborn preference. Elizabeth Murphy often said in some of the work that I've read, throughout the years, she says, typically says that at the age of 3, you could already identify certain natural inborn preferences from, just looking and observing kids' behavior. Now, the first dichotomy is what we see as extroversion, introversion. Now, again, this is something that often is misunderstood to being either confident or non-confident. This is really to do with where you get your energy from. I often see it as either having a robot toy that's got batteries that you actually insert into this battery, into this toy, and it's got its internal energy or power that it generates, versus a toy that needs to be plugged into the wall, so an external source of energy. And this is very similar to what we see with extroverts versus introverts. So extroverts are typically action orientated, outwardly focused. They get their energy from people and things. They tend to be slightly more talkative, interested in a lot of things, where introverts tend to be reflective more, tend to need to be able to just pause for a second prior to responding to certain triggers. They tend to want to have a space in which they can just generate their own energy, but it doesn't mean that they cannot be CEOs of large corporates. They just get their energy from different spaces. The next dichotomy is what type of information we prefer to use. Now, we either have sensing individuals, where you get the S from, or intuition, where you get your N from. Now, just to take note, for those of you not familiar, the N is coined as the letter that's being used due to the introversion using the I already. Now, sensing individuals typically get or prefer to take in information that's practical, concrete, what is now. They tend to use their experience. They tend to prefer a step-by-step, a view of things that they can understand, that they can touch, that they can see with their senses. Whereas people who prefers intuition tends to enjoy information that is slightly more abstract, slightly more, looking at the big picture first before going to the detail. Now, we always do this in the certification training, where we give people, for example, a box of Smarties, and we divide them into sensing individuals versus intuition individuals. And then we ask the sensors to identify what it is that they see when they are handed this box of Smarties. And the same would go for the intuition people. Sensing would typically come back to say, we see different colors, often mentioning the colors. They actually write down what the barcode at the back says, how much sugar is included. They see a box, they hear the sound, they shake it. But there's a very concreteness about the information shared. And then you get your intuition people. And I recently had somebody saying, when I asked them, what do they give me, what do they get from this box of Smarties, or what do they see? His response was, I think of my granny's house. I think of cooking. I think of love. And he then had the whole story about his granny used to love Smarties, and when visiting his grand's house, she used to cook, but at the end of each meal, there would always be sweets, and Smarties one of the sweets being available. But you can see how they make leaps and jumps from the concreteness to the more abstract sense of or use of information. Then we have the third dichotomy, which is thinking feeling. Thinking feeling is typically how you make decisions. So the process that you typically follow in making decisions. Thinking feeling has got nothing to do with gender. So it's not that women are more sensitive and feeling than men being more thinking. It's got absolutely nothing to do with that. This is typically, so where do your preference, where's your preference in decision making? Is it first from a thinking perspective, the rational, the factual, the black and white, actually trying to step out of the situation? Whereas people who prefer feeling tend to want to step into the situation, want to understand where people come from, understand what the implications of a decision is on people. To step into somebody's shoes is typically what somebody with a feeling preference tend to want to do in order for them to feel as if they can make effective decisions. And then last, it's how we typically organize the world around us, how we prefer to interact with the world around us, with judging individuals, wanting structure and order and planning, and perceiving individuals prefer being slightly more spontaneous and flexible. So I often look at when I go grocery shopping, for example, you typically have these two types playing out so nicely. You have your judges who's got a list that they have in their hand while grocery shopping, and they tick off the list as they go, but they know what they came to buy, and they know where their list is, and they know that they will be making with what it is that they're currently purchasing as well. With your perceivers, they sometimes do make a list. They sometimes forget their list, not sure where their list is, and then at the end of the day come home and they've potentially bought everything except what they intended to go and buy. But it's definitely more of a flexibility in spontaneity that goes with the perceiving preference. Now, remember what I said in the beginning, there's no right or wrong, and we make use of all of them. So there's not one of us that only makes use of one, but there are definitely some of these preferences that we tend to feel more comfortable in using or confident in using than others. So this gives you just a brief overview, and then we combine these, depending on what your preferences are, into a 4-letter code, which then gives us a lot of insight in understanding ourselves and understanding others. Now, after I've explained that to you, I would want to go into a few ways in which we make use of that then in understanding and looking at conflict. Now, the first and the most simplest way of looking at conflict would typically be around just looking at who shares, or the parties involved, how many symbols do they typically share? Now you can imagine if there's two individuals who shares many symbols, chances are that communication will likely be slightly easier. The way in which they make decisions, the way in which they assemble or gather information would be potentially similar. Even the way in which they organize their lives would be similar. And often you see that there might be a little bit less friction the more symbols you do not share if you don't have insight into a specific, person's preferences and, type theory, for example. It might create a lot of conflict, but it doesn't mean that you don't have conflict when you share all symbols. There are, Yerpi said to me the other day as well, there's sometimes with couples, getting married, sharing every single symbol, it at times may work beautifully, but at other times it may absolutely blow up in their faces as well and create a lot of conflict. So because you share symbols doesn't mean that they won't be. But you can imagine not sharing symbols and not having insight into those shared symbols could create conflict. Now let's look at a case study. Now this is a financial services industry, consultancy, which I worked with a little bit less than a year ago. They phoned to say that I need to please come and help with performance management. They said to me that there's performance issues and they're not sure how to deal with it. I went in for the initial conversation just to understand what exactly it is and how we can deal with it. I immediately picked up that there's quite a lot of there's conflict and that the team isn't at a great place. So there's trust issues, etc. And due to them being, quite a small group of individuals, I thought, let's just first start, before we start with performance management, let's just first start with something that is positive, something that is more team building orientated, that improves communication, that just puts everybody in a position to actually constructively to work towards what the problem is. And we started off with an MBTI workshop. Interestingly enough, we had the majority of the team, 10 individuals, including the owners of the consultancy as well, all coming out as ISTJs or then ISFJs. And one individual who was very important and central to business development, client orientated, also had some or shares in this specific practice, but coming out as the only ENFP. Now, for those of you who are familiar with ENFPs, you would know that they love to explore possibilities, that they are open to change, that they love new ideas, people's experiences, that they are quite spontaneous, that they've got a sense of enthusiasm and energy that goes along with it, that they really care about people. And then we also know that ISTJs are structured they've got very high work ethic. We know that they've responsibility. We know that they are particular on details and plans, and they need to really they're highly committed and highly loyal to each other or the company that they work for as well. And now what happened here is it just snowballed throughout months of frustration with one another and not understanding where each of the two parties are coming from. So he would typically make appointments and then last minute cancel it, where they needed to prepare for these appointments and print out certain documents, etc. Or he would change the direction of the appointment while the client was sitting in front of him at his desk, and then he would get one of the ladies who were more administratively supporting him and ask that they change and they print out new things, and now he wants the testament to be printed out as well. And so it was impromptu so they couldn't plan for it. And every time they thought that they've got some structure going, some process going, he would come and change it up a little bit. The tension in the office then became so toxic to some extent that he then started to actually see clients at his house and restaurants, and he really just wanted to avoid, because it felt as if everybody is against him and they ganged up, so he didn't feel welcome there anymore. And all stemmed from, or not all, but a lot of it was quite clear in just understanding each other's types, understanding and valuing each other's positives, and also what stretches them and what stresses them out. I think, so long story short, the MBTI helped. We've not done any performance management thereafter, but it is something that then became more of a language and an understanding within the office culture than what it was. Now, it's not fixed, but it is, I think, in a better position as what it was. Now, that is a straightforward case study, meaning one can imagine anybody that would, anybody that knows anything about type or personality preferences could expect the, tension and conflict because of the, the different preferences and none of the symbols being shared by those parties. But I think when it becomes a little bit more intricate is often when we add stress, or what we refer to from an MBTI perspective, and in the group type of environment that an individual feels or finds themselves in. Now, I think, again, for people who's not certified on the MBTI, they sometimes think that the type that is generated by, let's say, a free online version of derivative found on the internet is how deep it goes. But that is only the start. Hence why, the training actually takes about 4 days, is that there's so much more depth, not only in the facets. So you actually get a deeper facet measurement within the MBTI, but you also do have certain things, type dynamics happening when people are under pressure. And one know that, with conflict, there's often pressure and vice versa. So, so what we know is that when we are at our best, we tend to be able to manage and understand others and manage ourselves. But then when stress increases, we tend to actually become more of what we are. And then what happens is we tend to sometimes fall into behaviors that nobody would have ever said ourselves to be or themselves to be known for. Now, to give you an example of what happens there, without trying to be too technical here, would be they often use in explaining this the dynamic using this road trip analogy, where you have in type the two middle preferences. So how you prefer to take in information and how you make decisions. So those two middle symbols, because you have a preference for two of them, but the other two you still make use of. So the other two that is not shown in your 4-letter dichot or 4-letter symbol doesn't mean that you don't make use of them. You often also make use of them, especially under stress. Now, what happens is they typically say your dominant function, regardless of what it is, I'm not going to work it out now for you to say, we'll look at an example in a second. Your dominant function is typically the driver of a car. Going on a road trip, you've got a driver, he's competent, he knows where he's going, he's the one typically in charge. And then you typically have a passenger. That is known as your auxiliary function. That is also a function that, even though there are some shortcomings, but it is a passenger who still is looking to the front and's got some competence. But then you have a teenager at the back, and you have a baby in a car seat. Now, the teenager in the back is seen as your tertiary function, and then you have your fourth function that is typically seen as your inferior function. And that is often where we are all under a lot of stress. We see the baby taking charge of the car. So the behavior that is shown is behavior that is absolutely not expected from that specific individual, for example. Now, to give you an example, we have, for example, an ISTJ or an ISFJ. Now, their baby, their inferior function is intuition. Now, often we see ISTJs as being effective, finishing things, detail-orientated, but being able to move on quickly and efficiently. But then suddenly, because their baby is intuition, we sometimes, when they are under a lot of stress, we see them being so caught up in details that they can't move through it. We see them becoming completely negative and pessimistic. We see them being so, lose complete control of where they typically are seen as very efficient. And often, and the same would go for people that's known as a feeling individual, caring. If their inferior, which is their baby, is thinking, they may at times be the most critical, abrasive, controlling, demanding individuals if they are in the grip. that is often where you afterwards think by yourself, yes, I would have never said something like that to somebody, but it is often under an enormous amount of stress. Now, a case study just to showcase a little bit of it. Succession, a real life succession. So an older gentleman moving out of the company, and he's got a younger successor taking over. I mean, looking at their profiles, the older gentleman being an INTJ, the younger gentleman being an INTP, very similar, shared symbols. One can imagine them communicating effectively. One can imagine them being sharing the ways in which they typically would approach problems, the type of information that they ask for, etc. So a lot of similarities between these profiles. Now, as the succession plan continues and as the handover moves on, you actually start increasing the amount of stress and change that these two individuals are going through. And you can see where there is the tension being picked up. First of all, the dominant functions, even though dominant, still being in charge, still being quite effective in how they work with these dominant functions. But the more the stress is added to the situation, the more they are exaggerated in their dominant function as well. The one wanting, so the older gentleman wanting to make sure that all information is considered, so that intuition being dominant, wanting to just to make sure all viewpoints are considered and incorporated, wanting to keep it open for a little, wanting to just to make sure that all alternatives were thought of. Whereas the dominant T tends to say, let's just finish, let's just conclude, let's just move on, let's just have what we have in front of us, it's black and white, and let's just conclude on that, and not necessarily think of incorporating all viewpoints. And as you move down in your auxiliary, your tertiary, and in your inferior, at the end of the day, when at high amounts where there's a lot of pressure and a lot of tension between the two, you see the older gentleman zooming in on details more so than they would ever think of doing and what would be natural to them. It's the baby taking over from a sensing perspective and a detail being really stuck in a rut, and the inferior of your INTP, your younger gentleman, becoming emotionally pessimistic and saying, bugger this. So again, shared symbols, but still in conflict situation, you do see that the intricacies and the dynamics also tend to play out. And if you don't understand this, you would not know what to look for and how to use type to ensure that you effectively deal with it going forward. And then the last view that I have from a, and this is not the only ones, there are many different views or ways in which one can understand conflict, but this is one that is often not used, but in the same vein, so useful, especially for an audience that might not be familiar with type, but it is the temperaments. Now, the temperaments are typically are these 4 animals, and being described as the NTs being the wise owl. These are typically people that are intellectuals. These are typically people who loves to understand the why behind things. We know the wise old owls to be, they if we think of an owl in the cartoons that we've seen them play out, they are always, the clever ones. They are, however, enormously good at hunting in precision. They're often quite skilled, and this is all characteristics that you find with your NTs, with your owls, as a temperament. Then noting in those storybooks of kids where there's ships that sank and the dolphins saved, the sailors and brought them to shore. And that is exactly also how your NFs, your dolphins, typically are seen. And they represent warmth and empathy. They really desire to connect to people. They're quite creative and imaginative and enthusiastic, but they really want to see a positive impact on the world. Then we have our foxes, our STs. Now, this is typically, your STs and your foxes are opportunistic, spontaneous, they're adaptable, they're very resourceful, they're quick to act, and they enjoy taking risks. If you can just think of yourself as, you know, a fox in a forest, you know, running from one possible hunt to another, you know, being resourceful in that manner. And then we have our beavers, our SF beavers, and they are really your hardworking. They work hard in building those dams, you know, collecting those wood, making sure that they protect each other, protect what it is that they're building together. They value responsibility, and they, you know, they really persist and work hard to find solutions structured to protect one another. So it's around that community and sense of community. Now, these 4 temperaments also approaches conflict differently. And this is also where I'm bringing in, from a topic perspective, there where we say, how does your type fight? Now, for all of you online, I don't know what your types are, and many of you likely don't know what your own types are. But thinking of the descriptions that I've added here, from an owl to a dolphin to a fox to a beaver, how does an owl, for example, how does an owl fight, and what is it that typically trips up an owl, and what would you need to know about an owl if you may be married to an owl, for example? But they typically see conflict as where there are differences in our value system, in our principles, in our that is what is for them, what is conflict, is if there's a underlying fundamental difference is what is conflict. But they see it as an opportunity, and they're not worried about change. They are actually quite excited about challenges like those. They love the process of problem solving, and they tend to be quite argumentative at times, because it's not for them it's not about a personal thing. It is about a learning thing. It's about a growing thing if we argue about certain things. They are definitely somebody that considers pros and cons, so the negatives and the positive, and use logic when they reason, and really don't like if it is a personal attack. That's not what they do. So if you do have conflict with an owl, you need to approach them calmly and rationally. It's not a personal thing. They do want to be able to actually look at it in new ways. They need to be able to discuss how they can make whatever the conflict is, how can they solve it, how can we problem solve around it, and let's try something new. What can we do differently? Look at other alternatives, for example. But they don't see conflict as a personal thing. They see it as an opportunity for growth. And then we've got our dolphins. So any of you who might be a dolphin, they find conflict stressful. I have a colleague who recently phoned, and we were it was so interesting because I'm ST, and my colleague is NF, is a dolphin, and this colleague of mine, we had a meeting and we were discussing a possible way forward, and I experienced it as an absolute factual conversation with no sensitivities. And I got a message later that evening saying, I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight if you don't let me know that we're fine. Are we fine? And it is again just showcasing the dolphins being really uncomfortable with any sense of conflict. So they may retreat or avoid conflict. Harmony is really important for them. And they would, at times, compromise completely and actually put their own needs aside, but then later feel slightly more cheated because you know, their own needs may not have been met, because they are so keen on the relationship just be fine that they don't necessarily put a lot of effort into making sure that their needs are also met. Communication is key, and they could be cooperative and creative and flexible in solving conflict or approaching conflict. So they're open to new. But you need to approach a dolphin in a warm and in a personal manner. You need to show that you're willing to work together. And if there's any negative feedback, if any of you are working with dolphins, for example, in your team, just start by creating a safe space prior to you criticizing or addressing the negative, for example. That is quite important for a dolphin to consider as well. Then we have our fox. And I'm nearly done. Know that we have 10 minutes left. But our STs, foxes, now they see, this is also what I am, and they see conflict as a normal part of life. It needs to be dealt with realistically, practically, and often what generates conflict with a fox would be if something is experienced as being unfair. Is if there's inconsistency or if there's issues that's not being resolved or addressed. It needs to be treated in a logical manner and quickly, efficiently. Let's get over with. Let's look at the facts and don't let emotions interfere. So don't make it an emotional issue. It's not a personal issue. It is a factual issue. And then you need to approach them in a calm manner. And I think if you want to see a quite harsh reaction from a fox, you need to be coming to a fox with some sort of conflict in an emotional manner without thinking your case or the situation through. So not having your facts in a row, not knowing what you're coming to them with. So get the details straight about the conflict and then approach the fox in a rational and non-emotional manner. Otherwise, you might see quite a reaction from a fox as well. And then we have our beaver. So this often stems, the conflict often stems from a sense of interpersonal issues. So especially there where they think people are being taken advantage of is something that is at the core of what they dislike and would be a source of conflict. So they see the negative impact conflict has on others, and that creates a discomfort. So they're really keen on making peace and that there is peace. So they would indirectly sometimes deal with conflict. And in what I mean by that is so that it doesn't feel or experience that others' needs are not met or that they might feel hurt in the sense. And then you need to approach them honestly and openly, but without blaming. So don't attack and don't criticize. And they will discuss the conflict, but people need to be kind and willing to want to work together. So they can discuss it. It's not that they are going to necessarily avoid it. They don't like it, but they will be open to it. But as long as everybody is willing to work together to address it. To some extent, we had quite a number of beavers with my first case study, and the avoidance that the ENFP showed, that the dolphin showed towards conflict, was more a frustration for the beavers than anything else. Now, last very short case study is there's a team that I'm currently working with. It's a fast-growing team. Well, fast-growing in the sense of it's a small team of beauticians. They've got a beauty salon, with the owner being a beaver, and they are adding people or specific, nail technicians, etc. And they started off as a one-man show, and they are now a team of 7 individuals. And suddenly, as an owner, not myself, as the owner of this salon, is finding herself in a position where there's a lot of personalities, a lot of dynamics, and she, being a beaver, is struggling with some of the tensions, the anxieties, and the conflicts in the communication. It is interesting how, on the one hand, she, being a beaver, she wants her team to feel like a team. She will do anything for them and protect them as far as possible. But in the same vein, she sometimes packages certain behaviors that she doesn't agree with, or that she wants to address, that is negative towards company or client, in such amount of tissues that the people working for her doesn't even realize that there's an issue. She is to some extent so keen on the people that she sometimes forget about the importance of the actual business of what needs to be done, and not only making sure that everybody is happy, because that is her main purpose, is to ensure that everybody working for her needs to be happy. But as a case study, it is easier because this is an ongoing current process, it's easier to work with the individuals from a temperament perspective, because of the depths that we will not be going into, but rather to understand each other from a dolphin and a beaver and a fox perspective, understanding what each of them bring to the table, understanding, however, what their blind spots are, because many of them tend to see conflict as something that is harmful, and they don't address it, which is then actually brought to not being brought to the fore, not being addressed, and then you start seeing people talking about it behind closed doors, which is actually creating more toxicity than what the intention was. So again, addressing communication and conflict via your temperaments is quite useful in certain cases as well. Last but not least, I think, regardless of what your type is, whether you're an INTJ or an ENFP, whether you are responsible for the conflict that is that you're faced with, whether it's with your kids, with your husband, or with your colleagues, I think a very basic 4-step model that I think all of us can apply is to ensure that we first, just with any conflict situation, create a little bit of space. And if I mean space, it typically correlates with our perceivers. Our judges tend to want to conclude on stuff very quickly and action stuff very quickly, and they tend to sometimes not consider all information required. So for yourself, in your own environment that you find yourself in, create a little bit of space and make sure that you consider people, consider the information required, give yourself a little bit of time prior to reacting to certain conflict. And then make sure that you think of the facts, the non-emotional facts. So that is typically adding value through the lens of your thinking preference. Whether you're an F or a T, it doesn't matter. You need to actually consider both. Both your thinking preference and your feeling preference needs to be considered. So what are the facts? What's the implication on people? Needs to coincide with every single conflict situation. And then you need to ensure that you seek closure. What am I going to do about it? In our previous case study with the Beaver as the owner of the salon, she often finds it difficult to seek closure. Her being self-perceiver, she tends to try and address certain things, but it never goes into certain decisions to be made or actions to be taken. And that is enormously important for one to not have recurring conflict situations. So think of this, where you find yourself in a conflict situation, create space, don't react immediately, add value from a factual perspective in terms of what does the data say, what's the implication on people, and what is the actions that I need to consider. So conflict is inevitable. And for us all to effectively deal with conflict is essential. I personally won't be able to do this without self-insight, but understanding myself, but also being able to understand others. And again, as I mentioned, Yopi said it in the beginning as well, we've got hundreds of different assessments, but I don't know of anything that actually is as non-threatening and positively phrased as the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, hence making it so valuable in these types of situations. So Nelson Mandela said this, and I just do think that it really rings truth to type as well, is if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his language, so not the language that he understands, in his language, that goes to his heart. When you talk to somebody in their preferences, not in yours, that is what actually makes a difference to your relationship with that individual. So thank you very much on that note. For each and every single one of you who would want to be certified on the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, you can only on the next certification, though. This is not an ongoing deal for the rest of the year. This is only for the upcoming one. We will provide you with a 20% discount. For any questions, or please feel free to email us, call us, talk to us, and we can address those as well. Any thoughts, questions, Joop, or anybody else? I think, sorry for being purple, everybody. I do apologize, and I was just not able to actually